just in case you haven't seen this yet, this is pretty cool. And this, on the other hand, is not very cool. But it happens, and it happens quite often. Here we have a few little engines that have some problems. This one has some electrical issues, but we are going to be more concerned and working on this one here, this little 6-horse Yami. We need to take this other 3.5 off the stand here so that we can put our 6-horse up here. Now the complaint and the problem with this engine is that it has a rough running issue and that it blows out a bunch of smoke when it's running. So we've got to figure out what's going on with this engine. Now, like most of these little kicker engines, we'll generally run into two main problems. The first one is going to be directly related to the fuel quality and how often the engine runs. Because these little engines with these carbs just don't like to sit around idle, and if you've got some poor fuel, it doesn't take much to gum up the carburetor and start to give you all kinds of problems to deal with. That's why the first thing you got to do with these kinds of engines is to just see if they will even start and run at all. We want to check all the basics, like seeing if there is any fuel in the tank and if it's clean. Checking the engine oil and pulling the carb drain to see if fuel is in the carburetor. As long as all that checks out, we can add some clean fuel to the tank, and something that's pretty sweet on this engine is that it has this little primer bulb built into the fuel line here, which is a nice feature if you ask me. Now you've also got to make sure there is a lanyard in place as well, or you might end up getting a workout if you just start pulling on the cord hoping to get the engine to start. So we'll just pop a lanyard on here and then give it a couple of pulls. And if it doesn't start, you'll want to pull the spark plug out of the engine and see what it looks like. If it's all wet, then that tells you that the carb is supplying fuel. If it's dry, you'll need to pull the carb off because we aren't getting any fuel to the engine, which again is a super common issue. You can also just double check to see if you are getting spark here at this point in time as well by having someone help you and holding the plug against the block of the engine and pulling the cord to see if the plug is sparking. Now, as long as you've got the fuel and the spark, the engine should kick over, but you'll want to put it in a bucket of water because these have tiny little impellers that don't take much to break the vanes off of. Your larger engines have a beefier impeller that can take a little more abuse, but these little ones, they get pretty brittle, and more times than not, the impellers are forgotten about and neglected. So just like any rubber component, they get hard and brittle in the heat and with time, which makes them break easily. But once you get the engine in a bucket, we can fire the thing up and see if we can get it to idle and run properly. Most likely it won't, but we are really just trying to get the engine to kick over. You pretty much have to come to accept the fact that the carb usually always has to come off and get cleaned. It's really only a couple of hoses and 2 bolts that hold them on though. So once you take the throttle linkage off, the fuel hoses and the 2 bolts, we can disassemble the carb here on the bench and clean out any little debris that you find in any of the jets. We'll want to pull the float needle assembly off and inspect it to make sure that the needle is in good condition, making sure it is sharp and pointy and not rounded over. Then one of the crucial parts of cleaning any carb is getting these caps off the jets. But because they are made out of this really soft metal, you need to make sure you put as much pressure as you can with your flathead to get them to pop free, without stripping out the screw head. But once you get all of your jets out, you will need to be able to clean out the tiny little holes in the jets. Now, something that you might want to invest in if you have to do this pretty often is one of these little sets of what are called numbered drill bits. And you can get this for pretty cheap on Amazon. But they go just super small, and you can use these to clean out anything that might be in the jet of the carburetor. They go from like number 60 to 80 or so, depending on what set you get. But they work great, and they are a ridiculous lifesaver when it comes to cleaning out a carburetor. So once you get all the little circuits and jets and everything all cleaned out from the carb, we can put that back together and get it reinstalled back onto the engine to see what we are working with. And just like that, with only a couple of pulls, we're up and running. revving and idling like a champ. But now we can notice our next issue, which is the second most common thing to have to deal with, is when we look down here, we aren't getting any cooling water coming out of the engine. Which means we need to drop the lower unit and check on our impeller to see what's going on. The smoke and the rough running that was the complaint are obviously related to the carb issue, but it can definitely also be because the engine is overheating. And most of these little engines don't really have an overheat type of protection system per se, and can run pretty hot, and the heat can make them do funky stuff before having a major issue. So now we just need to disconnect our shift coupler down here on top of the lower unit, then pull out however many bolts are holding the lower unit onto the engine. For this 6 horse, we just have 2 bolts and we can pull the lower unit off. Now once we get this into the vise, we can pop this spacer off and get down to the water pump housing to pull that off. And it's pretty much exactly what we were expecting to see. An impeller with half the blades missing. Then when you actually look up into the housing itself, this has gotten super hot and melted the housing shut as well, blocking off any kind of water flow that might have still been coming from this 3-bladed impeller. Now just to show you how common this is, the other 9.9 horse that we have here had the same exact problem. Pull the lower unit off and boom, a water pump housing that has completely melted and closed off any passage to any water that the engine desperately needs. But the wonderful thing about these engines is that you can get this water pump kit that comes with a brand new housing, a cup, and impeller, as well as the gaskets, plate, and the bolts. Now in a pinch, with some work, you can sometimes try to salvage these housings by taking some time and a brand new utility knife blade and slowly cutting away any of the melted plastic that's blocking the housing. Then smash the cup back into place, but again, that's a cheap fix, though if you need to, it's an option that you should be aware of. Luckily, we had the kit, so we put the new kit with the impeller onto the lower unit. Now before sticking the lower unit back onto the engine, it's the perfect time to go ahead and change out the 4 tablespoons of gear lube that are in these cute little lowers. I really don't know how much lube they hold, but either way, it's not much and they are cute little lowers. Now we just stick the lower unit back onto the engine, fill up our bucket with water, and fire this little puppy up. Now after only a couple of pulls, it fires right up and she's peeing like normal. Rev it up a couple of times to make sure everything is advancing as it should, and make sure it shifts into forward and reverse as well. Now we can just reinstall it back onto the boat to confirm that it's getting all 6 of the little horses that it has.